So welcome you to the second online discussion organized by the Forum for Historical Research on Belarus, Forum für historische Belarus-Forschung. The forum was set up in the beginning of this year as a follow-up of a binational Belarusian-German historical commission. And it offers a platform. It offers a platform for research, historical research on Belarus, but also for researchers working on the topic. It places the history of Belarus or Belarusian history in a transnational context. And the forum has itself a transnational background because it offers virtual and sometimes also physical space for historians from Belarus, many of whom had to leave the country over the last years due to political repression. And it brings them together with scholars from other countries whose work also focuses on Belarus. And last but not least, we also want to engage young researchers into research on Belarus. So the forum is hosted by the German Association for East European Studies. My name is Gabriele Freitag. I'm the executive director of DGO. The forum is financed by the German Academic Exchange Service, the AAD, and it is coordinated by Alesia Bilanovic-Petz together with Elisabeth Wunderwald. And our discussion tonight will be held in Belarusian and English. We have simultaneous translation, and I'm very grateful to our translators, interpreters, Ales Lavinec and Veronika Mazurkiewicz. And languages can be selected using the globe icon that you see on the bottom bar of your screen. So you can select between German, English, and Belarusian. And you can also find the instruction in the chat. So please consult the chat if you have any problems, any questions concerning translation. And please note that this event will be recorded and published on the DGO YouTube channel. I think this is something you should all keep in mind. Our discussion tonight touches upon the aftermath of the Second World War and how people and societies in various countries try to overcome the experience of violence, of loss, of destruction. And tonight's topic is the outcome of a discussion that we had on how to relate historical experience to the current situation of war that people in Ukraine are facing. And we are very, very grateful to Magdalena Waligórska, who has set up the panel discussion and who will be our moderator tonight. Magdalena Waligórska is Associate Professor at the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage at the Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. And her fields of interest include contemporary Polish and Belarusian history, nationalism and national symbols, Jewish heritage and popular culture, music and identity, and memory stories. And her second book, Cross Purposes, Catholicism and the Political Imagination in Poland, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. So congratulations for that as well. So with this, Magdalena, I hand over to you. Thanks a lot, and I wish you all a very interesting discussion tonight.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to our panel tonight. We started planning this discussion several months ago because of our overlapping interests in post-war history of Jewish survivors in Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. And looking at these three countries, Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine, we all in this room today have been researching societies ravaged by war, societies decimated by the genocide, suffering traumas, We have been looking at communities that had to come to terms with loss, destruction, and the aftermath of violence. Societies that were seeking justice, but were also plagued by what Franziska Exeler called the ghosts of war. So the burden of their own implication in the violence, dispossession, and interethnic conflicts in this part of the world. So we thought initially it would be just interesting to bring together experts on the post-war period and compare how Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine coped with the traumas of the war. And then the new war came. And we all realized that the questions we have been dealing with are no longer purely historical. They suddenly became painfully topical, relevant, and urgent. And Second World War returned into the public imagination with full force over the last few weeks, inspiring propaganda and fueling new war narratives. But also at the same time, the Second World War somehow faded from view, started becoming overwritten with new traumas and new destruction and new suffering going on in the same region. So as the Central European societies were possibly not yet quite ready working through the trauma of the last war, suddenly we found ourselves in the middle of a new one. We started thinking about these questions. Can understanding World War II and its aftermath give us any insights into the current war and the challenges our region is going to face? What are the new challenges that the new war brings us, historians of the Second World War? What new questions appear? And what new taboos emerge? And also, can looking into the past help us understand what new beginning Europe will face after the end of this war? So these are some of the questions my guests tonight are going to address. And I'm very privileged to be able to host three amazing experts on the post-war history of Central Eastern Europe. Professor Natalia Aleksiun is professor of Holocaust Studies and Eastern European Jewry at the University of Florida. She specializes in the social, political, and cultural history of modern East European Jewry and has written extensively on the history of the Jewish intelligentsia in East Central Europe, Polish-Jewish relations, modern Jewish historiography, the history of medicine, and of the Holocaust. She studied East European and Jewish history in Poland, where she received her first doctoral degree at Warsaw University, as well as Oxford, Jerusalem, and New York, where she received her second doctoral degree at New York University. And her most recent book, titled Conscious History, Polish-Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, came out with the Littman Library of Jewish Civilization just last year, 2021. She is currently working on another book titled Hidden Lives, Jews in Hiding in Western Ukraine During the Holocaust. Dr. Franziska Exeler is our second guest. She is research fellow at the Center for History and Economics, Magdalena College, University of Cambridge, and also lecturer at the Department of Global History of the Friedrich Meinecke Institute of the Freie Universität Berlin. Her research interests include 20th century East European, Soviet, and German history, the history of the Second World War and its legacies in Europe and Asia, Holocaust and genocide studies, myth, memory, and trauma, borderlands and migration, as well as international law, transitional justice, and legal history. Her book, titled Ghosts of War, Nazi Occupation and Its Aftermath in Soviet Belarus, which has just appeared with Cornell University Press, examines people wartime choices and their aftermath in Belarus, and it shows how efforts at coming to terms with the past played out within and at times through a dictatorship. And finally, our third guest, Dr. Yechiel Weizman, is a lecturer at the Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at the Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He studied history, philosophy, and cultural studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and completed his PhD in the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa. His research interests include modern Polish Jewish history and culture, post-Second World War restitution processes, memory of the Holocaust, material culture, and spatial analysis. And his first book, likewise, just appeared with Cornell University Press, and it's titled Unsettled Heritage, Living Next to Poland's Material Jewish Traces After the Holocaust. Welcome everyone, and I would just like to say that we are going to engage in a conversation for roughly 60 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor for the questions from the public. So as I just said, all of you have researched the after effects of the Second World War, and also the really long processes in which the societies in East Central Europe have been reckoning with what has happened, with loss and trauma, and looking for justice, and living next to ruins, living next to mass graves, and coming to terms with the aftermath of violence. Now, which lessons, from your perspective, can the research on the aftermath of World War II give us, if any, about the future end of this current war in Ukraine, and the kind of challenges that the East Central European societies are likely to face at the end of this current war? Natalia, would you like to kick off the session and try to tackle this one? But you need to unmute yourself first.
Now it's working.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be here in such a wonderful company. So thank you for the invitation and for this question, which in a way is an impossible question. So let me just really share some initial thoughts as this was raised to us. First of all, to some extent, I don't believe in lessons learned, and somehow that we can apply our expertise from one region of tragedy and destruction to another. And yet, as a historian of the Holocaust, and I think of myself more as a historian of the Holocaust than of Second World War, and these are obviously connected, but in a way, for reasons for another discussion, they are not same histories. I can't stop thinking about these parallels and these possible aftermaths. So what I was thinking of, again, when we hopefully get to the point when we can face the aftermath of this war, are practical and more discursive. So in practical terms, there's a question of returning or not returning home. And I've been spending this academic year in Warsaw, where the presence of thousands of Ukrainian refugees is very much tangible, audible, and people are constantly raising, I think, for themselves also a question whether they will and under what conditions they will return home. And this was very much a question that survivors were facing, asking themselves, trying, giving up on. There's a question of children. We have various data on children that are separated from their families, orphan children, and to whom these orphan children may belong, who may claim them. I very recently witnessed a discussion in Warsaw about how all these thousands of children somehow miraculously became part of Polish demographic landscape. So there is already a temptation to claim these children, refugee children, possibly for another country. There's a question of family unification. Obviously, something that I'm very interested in is projects of recording testimonies, recording and documenting that was so much part of the aftermath of the Holocaust, and with very similar motivations. There is the legal motivation of documenting crimes for future justice that is to a large extent modeled after trials that took place, or hopes for trials after World War II, but also for history, for posterity. So it's fascinating to see how this documentation is already so mature as a project that one undertakes in the midst of destruction. And then I'm very interested in the narratives of what happened, what is still happening in the context of loyalty, in the context of civic loyalty, in the context of suffering, in the context of national history, and sort of placing this most recent drama in longer historical perspective of Ukrainian history, of Ukrainian-Russian relations, of Ukrainian-Polish relations that are very much being rewritten or rethought out. A new context of language, I think, will be very interesting as well. Sort of the language bubbles in which certain narratives might be separate, might sort of be happening parallel. And again, I want to leave time for my wonderful co-panelists. So just will drop one more, which is the narrative about perpetrators and the whole discourse of humanity or lack of humanity of perpetrators. This is so much part of Jewish thinking about what is Germany and who are Germans. Are they a nation of perpetrators who duped Europe to think that they are a cultured nation, and yet they were something else? And the extent to which we may see a similar reworking through trauma in thinking about the Russians as a kind of national community of perpetrators. But this is just to get us started. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this already kind of very rich landscape of problems that might be universal for these two conflicts. One of the theme fields that you mentioned was this search for justice, legal processes of the trials that are already being planned in the case of Ukrainian war. Franziska, would you like to expand on that field, that being the field of your expertise?
Sure, and let me just start by saying thank you so much for the invitation, and to my wonderful co-panelists for the discussion that we're just started. Perhaps very briefly, 2 points. Let me start by saying that I think that, like every war, the consequences of Russia's war against Ukraine, I think, are going to be tremendous, both in the short term and the long term. And I think we can look at this on various levels: political, economic, social, cultural, personal. We can look at it just by focusing on Ukraine, for which obviously the consequences are gravest. We can also zoom out and ask about regional or transnational or global consequences, perhaps. I would just like one thought about the personal consequences and how that reverberates with or resonates with us studying the Second World War. I mean, obviously, the extent of violence that the Second World War and Nazi occupation brought over Eastern Europe was much more extensive than the violence Russia's war against Ukraine has thus far produced. Still, obviously, from a personal level, every loss of human life is an utter tragedy, an utter catastrophe, and something very life-shattering for those who lose loved ones. And so one thing that I've learned from my research on the Second World War and its aftermath is that for those who either lost loved ones, who themselves became victims of violence, whether that meant torture, rape, else abuse or mistreatment, or had witnessed how human beings did these things to others, the war never became history. So we often use these words of like coming to terms with the past or confronting the past, and I've used that in my research as well. There is no general timeline for grief and trauma, and I think we see historically that this varies from individual to individual. Still, not one of the individuals that I have studied through memoirs or through letters or other testimonies has in any way sort of learned to live with the past. So the past is always present, and the grief and the trauma is also present in it, and it pops up in different ways. But the war in that sense never becomes history. And I think that's something that we can universalize to every war, and it also applies to this one. On the question of trials, I think that's a very important question. It's also a very complicated one, which we have a huge, extensive historiography on. What is the purpose of criminal trials? Who are they supposed to serve? What kind of justice is it? With the problem of justice being such a subjective word in some ways, when we talk about the perception of it, not just the procedure and the question of whether a trial adheres to sort of due process, to the rule of law, whether it's a fair trial, but also, not that the question from the technical sort of perspective, but also then the perceptions thereof. So there are also lots of people within the field of international criminal law who say that if you look at, for example, the trials that the International Military Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that these trials serve different political purposes, but actually for the individuals who were survivors of violence, they had a much, much less of a positive impact or a positive effect than communal initiatives would have been. At communal initiatives of trying to sort of sort out questions of justice there, of sort of initiatives of reconciliation there. Obviously, that's a different context because it's a civil war context, but and again, it's a huge question. I just want to sort of pick up on that. And personally, I do think that what we see happening at the moment in Ukraine, I believe a first Russian soldier who's been put on trial for war crimes, is very important on a symbolical level, but we do not know yet whether that actually helps the individual victims of the violence. That is a question that they only can answer themselves.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Franziska. It's striking what you said, that war doesn't become history, really, and we are talking about the Second World War 70 years after, and this still seems to be the case. It becomes very evident, Yechiel, in your book, actually, that tackles these really long-term after effects of wartime destruction, and this really long process that people come to terms with kind of living next to ruins or living next to abandoned spaces, destroyed spaces, also spaces of the others, and how they tackle that. So what is your take on that?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for you, Magda, and for my co-panelists, and for this opportunity, very important opportunity. I think that although it's maybe hard to talk now about the long-term ramifications of the war, but of course, I think that for my own research on post-war Poland, I think there are few observations that might hold true in the case of the current war, unfortunately. And I think that such brutal and devastating war, which involves mass civilian deaths, material destruction, and displacement of millions of people, I would say shatters the very basic definition of a society, and it generates aftershocks that continue to reverberate years and decades after the end of the conflict. And it really redefines the cultural, economic, social, and political reality of societies and culture. So the end of the war and atrocities, which we all hope will be soon, will also be a departure point of a collective dealing with a trauma. And this processing of the trauma, which of course will be affected by so many different factors, is crucial in order to really return to life on the individual and collective sense. And while I was thinking about these questions, I remembered a poem by the Polish poet Wisława Szymborska that I guess some of you know, and I would just like to quote the first lines, and the name of the poem is The End and the Beginning, Koniec I Początek. And I will read just the first line. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. And yes, I think that the rubble will be pushed to the side of the road and the ruins of war will be cleaned up. But as the Polish post-war case and many other cases have shown us, the lingering and devastating effects remain long after the war's end. And even when the material rebuilding takes place rather quickly and people are resettled into new houses, as we saw, for example, in Poland, the whole notion of, for example, property relations is undergoing a substantial shock, not only due to different political settings like happened after the Second World War, but also due to the sheer destruction of residential quarters, of basic infrastructure, and also due to the displacement of the entire population. And not only for Jews, but for many others in post-war Poland, coming back to life in the most physical sense was fraught with so many difficulties and challenges, which drastically changed the very basic fabric of Polish society and culture. And I think there is always the tension, as we saw in the Polish society, between, I would say, the desire to start a new life, to overcome the trauma of the past, and the inability to really do so due to the traumatic experiences. And often this tension, I believe, both on the personal and the national level, leads to repression of certain memories and to development of certain emotions like shame and guilt. And it can lead, as we saw, it led to development of certain lacunas and narratives that do not always leave room for different problematic memories and experiences, and sometimes instead encourage silences. So these are, I don't know if lessons is the right word, as Natalia mentioned, but these are some of the observations that I think might also hold some universal truths, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And Natalia, you wanted to react to that, please.
Yeah, that's the beauty of a conversation. So I want to follow up from what Franziska said and Yechiel as well, because what strikes me, and Franziska, you especially, you said, you know, there are certain structural differences to the two situations we're discussing. And one thing that I would like to stress, oh, I'm very sorry. One thing that I want to stress is that we have no victory in the context of survivors. That is, while Poles, ethnic Poles, that is, and other inhabitants of East Central Europe are rebuilding in some way, following the war, that in some way the Third Reich, right, was squashed. The war was in some way in the end victorious. For the Jews of the region in general, they participate in this victory with a sense that their joy is overshadowed, and this is something that is so very present in all the testimonies of survivors. When this moment of victory comes, right, when the tanks appear on the horizon, people might be cheering and embracing, and for the survivors, what comes is the realization of all the massive personal and communal destruction. This is, of course, putting aside the question of a political difference in interpreting what the Soviet tanks meant for Jews and for other many other East Central Europeans. But I think that this is something that hopefully when this war comes to an end, and that this is a victorious end, that there will be hopefully a victory, right? There is a possibility of that victory.
Mm-hmm. Franziska, did you want to add something? No, okay. I think it's so fascinating to look at these differences in perception of the war itself, but also the post-war strategies of dealing with trauma, and also the different extent of trauma in different ethnic groups for once, but also in different regions, in different parts of the region we're talking about, East Central Europe. And I would like to ask you now, you being experts on Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, if you could tell me to what extent all three countries experienced the trauma of the Second World War in similar ways, to what extent there was a kind of a universality of trauma, and to what extent they kind of followed different paths or different trajectories in the process of coming to terms with the Second World War. So how they dealt with their societal traumas in distinct ways, if that was even the case. I wonder, would you, Franziska, like to start with the Belarusian case, it being a Belarusian historical forum, to open the floor for this discussion?
Sure, thank you for that question. I think, first of all, when we talk about differences in these post-war societies, obviously we have to talk or clarify that when we speak of post-war Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, we speak of these countries in the post-1945 borders. So meaning the borders that reflected the westward shift of the Soviet Union, and thus also the westward shift of Poland, as confirmed at the Yalta Conference. We still have big regional differences here then within each of these countries. Obviously in the case of Belarus, maybe still in some ways significant differences, in others less, between the western and the eastern part. So the eastern part having been Soviet for roughly 2 decades before the war, and the western part was only annexed from Poland in 1939. It was northeastern Poland before that, then became Western Belarus in 1939 after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Then in 1941, as all of Belarus came under Nazi occupation, was under Nazi occupation for 4 years, meaning by the time that the Soviet authorities returned, Western Belarus had actually been longer under German rule than under Soviet rule. And so that differs also in terms of simply for in terms of how people remember when the war started. Did it start in 1939 or did it start in 1941? Again, I think we talk about comparing these different trajectories in the post-war period. We can do this on different levels. We can do it by looking at trials and criminal trials and questions of prosecution of those that the returning authorities deemed to have collaborated with the Germans during the war. And here we see many similarities between post-war Ukraine and post-war Belarus, simply because both were part of the Soviet Union, and this was a process that was centrally sort of monitored and steered by the Politburo in Moscow as the leadership of the Soviet Union. And within that process, we can see the way in which what you can call the Soviet politics of retribution, perhaps the way in which they deal with Soviet citizens deemed to have collaborated with the Germans, is that we can see that this is a process that takes place that alternates between more lenient and stricter phases, less active and more expansive phases in response to shifting domestic and international constellations. So it starts in the beginning of the war. It's very expansive, very indiscriminate. Then there's a turning point in late 43, early 44, where it becomes much more focused and also less strict. the prosecution rates remain relatively high until the death of Stalin, then they drop. And then so in the 1950s, later after the death of Stalin, not quite much is happening. And then we see a second wave of trials happening in the 1960s. So I think that's way in which we can compare things. But I think on a more sort of personal communal level, there are, for Belarus, I think two things important. For one, especially for Holocaust survivors, some regions continue to be more volatile, more dangerous than others. And this has to do with the question of where let's call them sort of nationalist formations who are fighting also against the return of Soviet power are present. So in the case of Belarus, that means there's the region around Novorodok and Vileka, where the Armia Krajova is still active until early 1945, is a place which from the summer of 44 to sort of throughout 1945 continues to be a relatively dangerous place for Holocaust survivor, although perhaps not as dangerous as similar sort of rural areas in Western Ukraine. And then in southwestern and Belarus, the border regions with Ukraine, where members of the UNPA, the Ukrainian nationalists, are active similarly. But again, here, overall, if you compare to Western Ukraine, nationalist resistance is much weaker to the return of Soviet power. And so the state security organs are able to get a grip on the countries, even the grip of the countryside much faster. And that's in Western and Eastern Belarus is not affected by that. So that doesn't apply to Eastern Belarus. There we don't have the same kind of volatility or fragility for Holocaust survivors. And the cities, again, is also a different question. And perhaps as a last sort of aspect or point to make, there's obviously also, we look at the German occupation of Belarus in its post-1945 borders. There's the immense sort of almost complete destruction of the Jewish community, but there's also massive violence towards the rural population as in these so-called anti-partisan operations, when the Germans razed to the ground up to 9,000 villages and killed their inhabitants, and often using similar tactics. If we look at the way in which the violence is sort of being carried out, it's by killing or by burning people alive in their barns. And so there's that memory of that traumatic violence as well in the countryside. And so we don't only have sort of Holocaust survivors, but we also have a massive amount of violence and people returning to the villages that no longer exist, many of them which are not going to be rebuilt. So that, I think, seems to me a very different experience, for example, from somebody who moves to Silesia after 1945. So and would be considered part of Polish history, but it's just radically different. So.
Natalia, in your perception, is the Ukrainian post-war situation similar to that of the Soviet Republic of Belarus, or do you notice some characteristics in the Ukrainian case that differed from that scenario?
Well, it's very much what I wanted to add. Very much follows up on what Franziska was saying, because there is also that duality, right? My research has been on Eastern Galicia, Western Ukraine, and this is precisely the area that was, for the most part, part of Austro-Hungary, then part of the Second Polish Republic, as Wschodnia Małopolska is Eastern Voivodeship of Małopolska, and then became Western part of the new Soviet Ukrainian Republic. And it also goes through the brief but eventful period of the first Soviet occupation and all kinds of political changes that it entails, then longer and brutal German occupation, and then is liberated from the Jewish point of view, certainly liberated by the Soviets and become part of the Soviet Union. So you also have two different Ukrainian stories here, two different stories of what is happening in this area when you look in terms of communal happenings. There is to a large extent the stories of local collaboration, of betrayals by neighbors are much more prevalent and dramatic in the former Polish part of Ukraine than in the Soviet part. And again, we could spend another seminar discussing it. And so we don't have, yes, we are now dealing with the Ukrainian state, but its history of coping is different and very much cut into two along this line. And then, you know, from the point of view of the Holocaust for Polish Jews, this is still part of their history, right? Because these survivors that emerge from hiding places and from Aryan identities in the spring and summer of 1944 see themselves as Polish Jews. If anything, they would not define themselves as Ukrainian Jews. And vast majority of them leave, just like ethnic Poles leave. So we have, in a way, to a much larger extent, sort of shared experience in this immediate aftermath than elsewhere in Poland, where for the most part, Polish local societies exist and continue to exist. Families are more impacted, less impacted, but you can return home. Whereas in that part, nobody's returning home. People are leaving homes, at least along these ethnic lines. And it's not always clear. There are Ukrainians who live as Poles, who there are intermarried couples who also claim Polish citizenship and Polish ethnic identity in order to move west. But Silesia or Lower Silesia, that especially that Franziska mentioned, you deal with the aftermath in a place that was not where you had experienced the war and occupation. So this is a very different story if you look bottom up from the point of view of familial and communal experience, not so much from the point of view of state policy and state politics. And of course, there is Poland like Kielce, if we're speaking about post-war anti-Jewish violence, that doesn't experience that kind of dramatic shift and dramatic uprooting, or at least not a dramatic uprooting outside of the Jewish community. And there is a difference if you look at on the map of anti-Jewish violence. Now, it's a question whether it's connected to property that Yechiel studied and mentioned in his first intervention, that people are coming to new places rather than Jews return or may try to return home and claim whatever they had owned and inhabited before. But there is a very clear divide. And I think that in that respect, this Polish-Ukrainian, Polish-Belarusian case is extremely interesting if we compare it, say, to some Western European aftermath, Western European returns and rebuilding efforts.
Mm-hmm. Hilik, you looked at the post-war fate of Jewish heritage across Poland. Would you also agree that there are Polish histories of coming to terms with the war and not just one kind of Polish scenario of coming to terms with the war, with the heritage of the war?
Yes, I think I would agree, especially if you look at Poland in its original pre-war and the western parts, Lower Silesia and others. So you can see that for Jews returning to their hometowns in pre-war Poland, what used to be Poland, for them, the attempt to preserve and protect their heritage site, it is really a moral and sacred duty. And also for the non-Jewish local population, it seems that these places, these ruined Jewish cemeteries, desolated synagogues, are now, after the war, acquiring some sort of a new role, some sort of symbolic reminders of the Jewish community. While when you look on Western Poland, on the former German lands, the Jews who are returning there are basically not attempting to preserve and to protect the former German Jewish heritage site as their brethren in other parts of Poland. So it seems that the relation towards the material Jewish traces of another Jewish community, the German Jewish community, had a different meaning for them. They used it to the extent that you can use it for religious purposes, but the level of commitment to preserving these spaces was very much different. And also for the neighboring new Polish settlers in these lands, it seemed that the presence of these sites, of these German Jewish sites, evoked, I would say, less antagonism than the similar Jewish traces evoked for the local Polish communities in towns that used to be part of Poland. So I think that it is a very interesting distinction in this regard.
Thank you, Natalia. Short comment.
I was actually wondering if Yechiel could comment on it, and it's connected to my previous comment about the sense of a essential lack of victory for the survivors, and their sense of uprootedness, and I wonder, and vast majority of them do leave, right? I mean, not everybody, but the immediate post-war years are a period of massive abandoning of East Central Europe, massive to the extent that there are survivors. But I wonder if, Yechiel, you think that this lack of emotional, communal, I don't know what is the proper adjective here, investment in German Jewish material heritage, if this was connected to a sense that this is culturally different and strange in a way, or that these people were essentially not planning to stay, and therefore this use was pragmatic but short-term in a way that they related to it.
Yes, I think in many ways, yes, there was a lesser extent of, I would say, sense of belonging to the place and to the landscape, and it really created, I think, a more practical treatment of these spaces that you can use, but it doesn't touch on some sort of intimate chord. And I think also because of the fact that, and you can read it also in accounts of Polish Jewish survivors who are resettling or being resettled in the West, these traces had also the mark of German culture, the same culture that tried to eradicate them. And also we know that the encounter between the new Polish, the Polish Jewish settlers and the German Jews, some of them still remain there after the war, was not such a good encounter. There were a lot of mutual animosity and hostility, and it seemed that although there were attempts to bridge the gaps, soon German Jews realized that they basically cannot stay, not only because of the repression as being Germans, but also because the new Jewish story that was starting to develop in this land was alien for them.
It really emerges with great force the extent of the challenges that the post-Second World War societies had to face in this part of Europe, and there was a lot of very different and complex challenges that they were facing. I was wondering, when that period of healing, that period of seeking justice, of reckoning also with one's complicity, when does that overcoming of the trauma after a war end, And do you believe that we have reached that point in the case of the Second World War? So have we worked through the trauma of the Second World War already in Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine? Or has this process now been interrupted by the new war? Natalia, would you like to have a go at this?
Yeah, this is such a complicated question, and in terms of what this last most violent aspect of the war that is ongoing. Right, it didn't start in February. What it means, I think we're still looking at it. It's a little difficult, and we're historians. We have the tools to look at past events, less so at present. I tend to think that the answer is yes and no, as much as this is a terrible answer to a question. I think that to some extent, again, depends where you look, right? To some extent, there is a great deal of work in the field of education, in the field of encounters between the now third generation, right, various NGOs that meet the youth from, and people seem to be much less predestined in their in those encounters by the traumas and stories of what had happened. And at the same time, I think, and this is particularly clear in the case of Poland, or at least this is the part that I know most intimately, is that the so-called difficult questions, the taboos that both of my wonderful colleagues mentioned earlier, they still trigger responses that suggest that this is still an ongoing issue. And so the question of collaboration, the question of the scale of neighborly betrayal, and who, if there was any betrayal of the Jewish co-citizens, who was betraying, right? Were there true Poles? Were there individuals that didn't belong really to the core of the Polish nation, and therefore the core of the Polish nation is innocent collectively? This is still leading to extremely powerful responses, particularly on the level of the state. And if this happens now, again, we can ask whether this is simply the use of these questions for immediate political purpose, for political mobilization, or does it really mean at the same time that the Second World War, the occupation, and the Holocaust still have the power to mobilize on a rather large scale? And I think the answer is yes. So I will stop here.
Mm-hmm. Which is leading up to my next question, but I would like to hear a couple of words from Franziska first about the Belarusian situation.
I think my sort of thoughts probably link up very nicely with what Natalia just said, which is that I mean, if we think about it as a process of working through, right, as a process of talking about the war, and in some ways of confronting especially the very painful questions, then again, I think we can answer this on different levels. For the person that said, I don't see sort of that there's ever an end to that. So working through ever remains a process, and sort of the trauma is there in everyday life. I think as historians we can study, though, if we study, for example, state-sponsored or civil society initiatives in a historical term, we see huge changes, obviously, and big differences between, you know, silence on certain topics, and on the other hand of the spectrum, or the other end of the spectrum, admitting guilt, and if it's meant sincerely so. And it seems to me, especially this point of admitting guilt is one that when we talk about, the success of working through these questions or dealing or confronting the past is very important. It has to be meant sincerely, obviously, and it has to be perceived as being sincere. But I think it's one that if you look at it back historically, has played a large role in that because it can facilitate a lot. Having said that, there was something else that I wanted to add to that, which is a bit of a different aspect. But if we look again at the ways the different political attempts of kind of, or what we can also call perhaps war narratives or the politics of the past, but also the confronting the past, historically relating to the Second World War, I think it's important that, while each of us has stressed how important the local and the context is and the different factors that play a role, I do also think that it's a process that at the same time we have to be aware that it's often an interconnected transnational processes, not always to the same extent. And again, I'm not talking about the very personal kind of trying to come to or dealing with the past, but on these political efforts. But we see this in the immediate aftermath of the war when we look at trials and criminal persecution, how much in each country they also respond to the international and what's going on outside of a given society. We see this very much in the 1960s when we have another wave of trials of citizens from Central and Eastern Europe accused of having committed crimes in the name of German power, and many of them standing on trial being accused of having committed crimes against civilians, Jewish and non-Jewish. We can see here how it's very much these trials are influenced by really global Cold War dynamics. And so it's not just in Central or in East European affairs, so to say. It's very much one in which the Soviet Union plays a large role, in which also then dynamics with the United States, where the Soviet Union then rightly so accuses the United States and Great Britain of harboring war criminals, people who served in the local German police forces and after the war managed to immigrate to the US or the UK. Their response to sort of the West German neglect of prosecuting hundreds of thousands of German nationals who'd committed crimes. So these trials in the wave of 1960s trials that take place within different places within the Soviet Union, but also in different East Central European countries like Poland, very much have to be placed on these different levels of their importance of the local, responding also to local context and national context, but very much interconnected in a transnational framework. And then as historians, we have to weigh which factors sort of always influence that. But yeah, just that as a thought on how to study these processes.
Mm-hmm. We mentioned a couple of times how long these processes are and what that they can take decades. You mentioned that before, Hilik. Where do you see areas in which East Central European societies still struggle with the legacy of World War II's trauma, where we are kind of not finished with it yet?
So I think this is a good question. I think that perhaps the Polish case can show us how, in many ways, the question of complicity, this is really the most heated subject in this process of coming to terms with the past. And well, it's, as Franziska mentioned, it is not only the local context, but there is many interconnection. And I think that the Polish case shows that what is interesting in Poland, that I think Poland exemplifies the case where you can see the most serious, perhaps, and substantial attempts to come to terms with the memory of the Holocaust. And the Polish society indeed underwent a collective soul searching and reckoning, following, for example, historical discussions in 2000 with the publication of Jan Tomasz Gross's Neighbors. So in many ways, and 1 year after the publication, we have the Polish president, Kwaśniewski, asking for forgiveness, one of the first East European leaders who apologized, a collective apology. But then you can see that precisely these attempts to come to terms with the Holocaust and with the part of involvement of part of the Polish society, these attempts are evoking a massive counter-reaction and nationalistic backlash, especially in recent years, since 2015 and the rise of peace to power. So I would say that you can see here a very dialectical nature of what it means to come to terms with a difficult past. So perhaps the deeper the level of collective reckoning with one's troubled past, the stronger are the backlash and attempts to rewrite history. So in this case, this is really a never-ending process in which you can see that as much as you have more and more discussions and collective reckoning, you will always have this. It seems to be a universal dynamic. You will also have attempt to counterbalance this collective reckoning with a very different collective set of emotions.
Natalia, you wanted to comment on that?
Yeah, I think in Polish there is this concept that many politicians of the currently in power camp introduced, getting up from the knees, right? Poland was on her, since Poland is a female. Poland was on her knees and apologizing, and now she's done apologizing. And I think that there is a bigger question of finding in this work through difficult history beyond academia, right? Because we can exchange our archival findings and publish scholarly articles. The question is what happens when it goes beyond academic discussion. And this was the phenomenon of Jan Gross's Neighbors, because this was a book sold at gas stations and read very broadly. And as Yechiel, you know, what Gross revealed was not a revelation for Israelis, for example. I remember an exchange of emails with a colleague of mine who commented, so Poles killed Jews during the war. That's big news, right? But for general Polish reading public, this was a very deep traumatic revelation, because people were raised with heroic narratives of fight and righteousness. So for me, the question is how one can find a way for societies that had gone through mass violence and destruction to have a sense of sort of collective dignity, and at the same time and pride, and at the same time face these difficult aspects of the past. And I wonder the extent to which the way in which the current war against Ukraine may affect our way of writing about the history of the Holocaust and the role of Ukrainians in it. And as most historians of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe know, collectively, in many accounts of survivors, Ukrainians are quote unquote worse than the Germans. Right? This is how this sense of collaboration is conveyed. So how do you write about this during and after the conflict in which Ukraine was attacked and defended itself heroically? So there is a certain difficulty in balancing the discourses and research and public history. That I don't have a key, an algorithm, but I think that we will be facing a lot of challenges and new backlashes possibly in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a very important point that you are raising, because we, even if we realize realize that us historians sitting in the ivory tower and discovering archives, discussing certain difficult topics are kind of a parallel universe to the wider society, listening to the news, watching the TV, and also watching war propaganda right now. These two worlds do interact, and it has an impact on how we work as well. And I think that in the last few weeks, we have seen the extent to which Russian propaganda has used and referenced the Second World War really heavily. And I was wondering for each one of you, actually, to what extent you believe that that this new war and the war propaganda that it comes with, and the way that it tackles the Second World War is going to impact our field of research. Hilik, how do you see that for yourself?
So I think that first of all, when you hear the constant reference to the Second World War in Russian propaganda, and the uses and abuses of the history of Nazi terror and the Holocaust, I think it should make us all aware to the question of memory. And I think it proves why historians who are dealing with this issue cannot avoid dealing with the question of collective memory. And there is a certain tension between historians and memory studies scholars, but I think that what we are witnessing now, that this separation just cannot exist anymore. And historians should address the question of how the past is being manipulated, used, reinterpreted, in order for us to not only understand what happened, but also what is happening. This is, I think, very crucial. And I think that in this sense, we as historians of the war and the Holocaust can also reflect on our own role as researchers and teachers, and in order to be much more aware of how to maneuver in this minefield. And maybe I will add something from my Israeli perspective. I think that listening to all of this constant wave of propaganda and references to the war, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, I think it makes a lot of more and more Israelis really understand and detect this grave danger of weaponizing anti-Semitism, of trying to really understand how certain terms are being used and abused, and how we should take very seriously these rhetoric traps, and really become much more aware of how certain dictums that we as Israelis, I'm speaking now, were very certain of, how they receive very new and obscure meanings. And I think also, although it's still maybe too soon to predict how the current war will affect the way we understand and remember the Holocaust, I think that you can see also what's happening in Poland. Already there are attempts to vandalize, for example, memorials of Red Army soldiers, even suggesting to erase war cemeteries of Red Army soldiers, and a certain attempt really to go back to the history of the war, trying to reflect on the role of the Red Army. And I can even detect some sort of new wave of trying to reinvigorate the double genocide theory, both in research, in commemoration, even some sort of new wave of this Judeo-communist that receive some sort of weird new life in light of this current war. So I guess it will take us to many different directions. Some, by the way, very positive, like being aware of certain biases and traps, but some, as we can see, are very problematic.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have to slowly wrap up our discussion and open the floor for our audience. But before we do that, I would like to hear from you, Franziska, a couple of words about the Belarusian situation right now. Belarus is obviously heavily impacted by the war in Ukraine, but is also at the same time a country that suffers probably the more severe limitations in terms of freedom of speech and freedom of science as well, and freedom of research. To what extent does the war change the minefields for historians in Belarus today?
That's a really interesting, it's a very difficult question, I feel, because it seems to me that through the war, Belarus has received more attention in good ways, in that when sort of the Russian government put all these limitations on you know, let's not call it free speech, but put all you know, made it made mentioning of the war as a war, sort of an act for criminal prosecution. When that news became sort of global or became a piece of international news, I felt that the situation in Belarus and the fact that for decades before the war, it had been much more repressive than Russia, became more of a fact that people became aware of. There is in Belarus a big debate today, which is linked to the question of how to speak about the war as well. We have a couple of people, I think, in the audience who also could say much about that. The attempts to try to criminalize the red and white flag, the ways in which denying that a genocide of the Belarusian people took place, also supposed to become sort of a criminal charge. It's I mean, I can only sort of kind of sketch that out, but I think in Belarus, really, the situation goes back to the protests in August 2020, and ever since then, the situation has been quite dramatic for anyone, obviously, who has been involved. The professional consequences, if you think of our colleagues who have been arrested and then released from prison, can also be quite dramatic. In that anyone is denied sort of even a job outside of university. So I feel like comparing kind of the impact that, or put it the other way around, my impression was always that until this war in Russia, you had all these different kind of niches and liberal sort of spheres in which you can say things that you were never able to say about the war, the Second World War, I mean now in Belarus. So in Moscow, you had with the Higher School of Economics, with the Center for the Study of the Second World War, there you had places where you could talk about complicity, you could talk about things of what is the meaning of collaboration, you could talk about sensitive, you could even talk about taboos. There was a way of sort of again, like niches of that kind of expression possible, whereas in Belarus for many, many years already that wasn't. And so my sense is that perhaps now, with Belarus being so tied to Russia in many ways in this war, it has perhaps come more to the attention of kind of the circle of people who are studying Belarus or who know these things before.
Since we do have a lineup of questions in the chat, I would just ask you, Natalia, for a very short comment.
Just a sentence, because it really follows up on, again, what Franziska was saying. I want to say that there is also a shift, I think, in how Holocaust history can be done and is being done among Ukrainian historians, and I think that they are facing very difficult situation in which when they are exploring the questions of broadly defined collaboration, it seems like they are aligning themselves with Putin's propaganda, and I think that in a way their situation, and I want to mention among others Yuri Radchenko and Marta Havryshko, two wonderful scholars, that this will be not only important work, but work that is really facing a lot of pressures and a lot of challenges that are, I think, more difficult than they were, more intense than they were before February 2022.
Mm-hmm. And this is probably one of the most worrying aspects of what is happening right now for us historians. I am opening the floor for the audience right now, and you can ask your questions either in the Q&A section or also raise your hand. And we have a couple of questions already, and there's a question from Viktor Szadurski. As in other republics of the USSR, in Belarus after the war, the main attention in the official coverage has been given to the heroes, to the winners. We have mentioned that throughout the discussion, and much less was said about the sacrifices and sufferings people had to deal with. How to avoid such an approach in the present and in the future that is properly referencing to the Ukrainian war right now? How can we avoid following that pattern of kind of heroization of the heroes and kind of look at the suffering? Does any of you have an answer to this very difficult question? Natalia?
I mean, I wouldn't dare to, to formulate advice, but I think that there is an ongoing effort. Even just thinking about the new official video of Stefania, of the song that won Eurovision, that is featuring the heroism of women, of the civilian population, and yes, part of the people that you see in this video are wearing uniform, but not all of them. And I think that in the coverage and in the official Ukrainian coverage as well, there is a great deal of attention given to the suffering of civilian population and the difficulties that they're facing. It's not all about the heroes fighting, but I agree, this is a very important challenge and something that we certainly see in Eastern Europe after World War II.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Franziska?
Just quite briefly to kind of follow up on that, I think one of the big challenges after war always that while there's, I think, sort of on an emotional level, kind of a huge, or one feels sort of a big sympathy for the heroes, if you agree kind of with a certain kind of narrative. I think the complicated part arises when it turns out that people who give their lives for a particular kind of cause that you identify with also commit acts that you would not want to identify with. So bluntly put, what do you do if heroes also commit crimes? And so then we reach again that problem of the silences, the taboos, the painful parts of the history. So I think and if we look at the history of the Second World War and the way in which it's been studied, I think this might be one of the things to take from it is to accept that, or I don't know, maybe accepting is not the right word, but to acknowledge that, if we want to use these categories, people can be sort of heroes or like defenders and sometimes perhaps perpetrators at the same time. And that it's often a very complicated, very messy story. And to acknowledge that you also have these, conflicts or contradictory things within an individual makes it so difficult, I think, to then sort of, deal with. So that's, I think, might be a big challenge kind of coming out of war in general.
So in other words, no heroes are innocent in no war. There's a connecting question here in the chat from Ludmila Szadurskaya in terms of, are the deeds of individuals or are the deeds committed in the name of a state something that should be the subject of collective responsibility after the war's end? Would you like to comment on that, Franziska? To what extent should we speak about collective national responsibilities for crimes or crimes committed by individuals or agents of the state?
I thank you for that question. I think it's a very really good, very difficult question as well. Maybe we can distinguish between legal responsibility, and there, this might now seem very technical, but I think it's an important achievement of modern law that only individuals are responsible for crimes. So you can only put an individual on trial, and it's about determining their individual criminal responsibility, what a fair trial is supposed to be doing. But so that would be, I think, kind of a legal definition of guilt of the individual. But obviously, there's also the question of collective responsibility, or a responsibility for admitting either the guilt of others or the guilt of what's been done in, or whether that includes family members or people that you don't know, admitting responsibility for that. I mean, I can speak now as a German citizen that I do think that the acknowledgement, obviously, of a collective German guilt, not in the sense that every individual is, guilty of every individual act that was committed, but of a collective kind of national responsibilities continues to be extremely important. And I think it is possible in this discussion to distinguish between, from a legal perspective, different kinds of degrees of guilt, while at the same time generalizing more and speaking of a collective responsibility, and certainly for speaking of a collective responsibility, not just by the generation that was living at the time, but also then later on by sort of following generations, of keeping that sort of present in public consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Something you wanted to add, Natalia, to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible not to have ideas as we speak coming. So to what Franziska was saying, I think it's a very important distinction. And again, also thank you for the question. But of course, it's really messy when we look closer, right? Because yes, individuals are put on trial, but then certain organizations are declared criminal, right? So not every person that was a member of SS ended up in jail, but as an organization, you were collectively sort of tainted. So whether in general German society performed this in the immediate post-war period, that's a different question. So this is going to be an issue as well, beyond whether you are a member of military high quarter or something on the side of the aggressor state. But I also think that there is an issue of a collective shame, and this is something that a lot of dissident voices of Russian citizens have voiced, speaking of themselves about themselves individually as being ashamed of being a Russian because of what the state is involved in. And again, we could talk about that sense of shame that certain generations, certain milieus in German society, less so Austrian, had experienced after the war. But also going back to that question of dealing with the memory or thinking and feeling about perpetrators after. I'm very interested. I don't think that anybody wrote about it, but maybe I missed it. I don't think there is a study of sort of the cultural anthropology of anger of survivors and survivors' families, or those statements of not buying German goods, right? Not listening to German music, not abandoning German language, even by those who were essentially German-speaking individuals. And again, this is something that I think is taken on by individual, but it's vis-a-vis collective in a most general sense, right?
There is, we have like 5 more minutes to wrap it up and finish the discussion, but there is a very pertinent comment in the chat section that is directly relating to what we have been saying. Can we really talk about collective responsibility in non-democratic countries? How people that were never able to elect their president are responsible for this? Would you have a reply to this comment? Franziska, would you like to have a go at this?
Okay, this is going to be top of my head. I mean, obviously there's always the question, who speaks on behalf of whom, right? And what I just said about a sort of a German collective responsibility, that is, should, also obviously take into account that even today there's a spectrum of opinions on that. And I do very much hope there's sort of a majority political a consensus on the importance of continuing to uphold that responsibility. But obviously there are enough sort of media venues to express other voices, and so that becomes so different than in an authoritarian state. And also obviously for historians, like how do you read sources? How do we know what people thought, what they talked about in the kitchen and at home, and what they said in public on a very general level. So I might be digressing a little bit from this question, but if we tie it back to the memory of the Second World War, and specifically in Belarus, I think one of the challenges of studying that is that there's a very strong state narrative in the Soviet Union in place, and then there's a strong state narrative today in place, which is not being just upheld by state authorities, but lots of people are also invested in it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that even though people who are invested in it share every small part of that narrative. I think there's enough overlap between people's personal memories and the state narrative to be able to invest in it, or even appropriate parts of it. But then there are obviously also other people with very different opinions, or whose personal memories, especially of the Soviet partisan warfare, does not confront to the very one-sided image that in the Soviet Union and in Belarus today is being put forth by the state about Soviet partisans as sort of the resistance fighters. But the actual memory, the family memory of Soviet partisans is a lot messier, especially when you go down to the level of villages and the experience there of day-to-day interactions. And again, like, how do you study that? I'm transgressing, sorry, a little bit from that question, but I think it's a very important one, and it's one that we as historians, if we tackle these questions both in history, but also now in sort of discussions about the present day, always have to ask what kind of sources can we then use to try to find alternative voices and try to make them speak or represent them in some ways.
Thank you very much, Franziska. Thank you very much, Natalia and Yechiel, and thank you, our wonderful audience. I have to apologize. There are some questions that will remain unanswered by the panel tonight, because we really have to finish in 2 minutes. But the results of this conversation, and I think that we have all realized that we have been really able to just touch the top of the iceberg, and there's a lot to be fleshed out here and a lot to talk about, and we have touched a number of very complex issues. But the outcome of this conversation we have been having today is going to be a written publication. This meeting has been recorded and will be published in a form of a roundtable discussion that is going to appear in a special issue of Holocaust Studies journal. So I invite all of you to check it out. Once it's published, we will be able to refine our answers and go more in depth and cover some of the ground we were not able to cover tonight. And apart from that, please contact us with any of the questions that remained in the air and remained hanging. Just email us. We will be happy to get in touch with you and to continue the conversation. Also, the conversation about the 3 books appearing and being a work in progress. Thank you so much, everyone, again, for your contribution to this discussion tonight. And I'd like to wish you a pleasant evening, despite the traumatic and the dark places that we have taken you to. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you,
you,
Franziska and Yechiel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Yechiel, Natalia, for a wonderful discussion.